Purchase your tracks today.
Blessings, peace, and strength and obedience in the will and way of the Father and righteousness by faith in the Messiah, who was sent by the Father to rectify the issue of sin and to restore those who had been separated from him while in his flesh and in their journey that we call life, and the fallen nature of man after the fall of man, the first man, that the second man will redeem and offer salvation that the Father has wrought through his blood and through his death and resurrection to be the first fruit. Unto you and your families, I pray that you are encouraged, that you are strengthened, and I want to say hello. It's good to see you, good to hear you, good to fellowship with you. Blessings and peace be unto you and your household in the ways of righteousness by way of the Father, sent through the Christ and in faith of the Christ, as led by the Ruach, the Holy Spirit. Today's video is a video that is not a part of our current series for a time such as this, Why Can't We Unite, but just a brief pause on some information that I came across, and when I came across it, it was very interesting. So with that being said, I wanted to share it, and when I share it, maybe you can see what I say. So shalom and shalom again. Just to be clear, what we're doing here is we're doing a book review. And the book review in which we're doing is one of the plethora of books that the Father has blessed me to come along that have expounded upon the expression and on his word. As he has said in a compilation in which we call the Bible, seek and ye shall find, knock and it shall be opened. When you start that process, it's a lengthy one, because history has hidden a lot of things, changed and substituted a lot of things. But with the Spirit, all things are possible. So with that being said, with us switching up for a brief second, we are going to do a book review. And the book review we're going to do is on a book by a gentleman by the name of Robert Wilberforce. And this book I found extremely interesting because it covers information from a perspective, his perspective, but with his research and scholarship within it, that has provided some interesting allotments to what is historical truth and what is conjecture, what is this blatant lie, and what is a mixture of the two. So the book in which we're going to be doing is going to cover a period from the fall of man into the establishment of the nations of power. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to read a chapter and review the chapter. I'll read a few sections within the chapter, and then I'll expound on what I was able to receive or what I got from it, and we'll continue on. And again, as I mentioned briefly earlier, Hopefully you'll be able to see why I thought it was important to share this information. There are a plethora of reasons that I will submit to you, but those things come in due time and not to get before you. So we're going to pick up. By the way, if you hear any extra bird chirps or things of that sort, I'm sitting out on the porch as I do this submission, so bear with me. All right. Shalom and shalom. Okay, so it is now changed from the chirping of the birds to the falling of rain. However, this is where we're doing our submission and our review. So with that being said, let's get into the 5 empires. Now, the 5 empires, as I stated before, was written by Robert Wilberforce, and it is an outline of ancient history. And with that, we will start with chapter 1, the antediluvian age, which Mr. Wilberforce has dated around 4004 BC. So 4004 BC. Underneath of the chapter name, which he entitled The Antediluvian Age, he has in caption, the 2 races, Lamech, Enoch, the flood. Let's begin. The original object of man's being is sufficiently declared by the manner of his creation. God created man in his own image, and in the image of Yahuwah he created him, male and female. And Yahuwah blessed them and said unto them, be fruitful and multiply and replenish the earth and subdue it. To set forth upon the earth Yahuwah's image, and to rule all creatures for their happiness, man was set into this world. By means of that natural perfection which he had from Yahuwah's image within, and of Yahuwah's outward presence, which would doubtless communicate him gifts from above, he might have continued in this happy state. However, he was cut off from Yahuwah's outward presence, and Yahuwah's image within became corrupted and debased. Yet even then he was not altogether forsaken, and the course of history declares by what means it has pleased Yahuwah to renew in some measure his lost image, and to give hopes hereafter of the perfection of restoration. The end of man's existence since the fall has been to compass this object, and with a view of it, he has to learn first what is the weaknesses and the degradation of his corrupted nature, and secondly, in what manner he may regain the purity which he had lost. A promise on this subject was given to the first parents, and as it was promised, the attainment of which did not rest with themselves, but was to be consequent upon the multiplication of the race. Therefore was taught to them that the recovery of Yahuwah's image was to be bestowed upon mankind, and not as separate beings, but as portions of a family, not as individual subjects of the King of Heaven, but as joint members of his community upon the earth. Mankind, therefore, did not originally run wild through the forest like the savages of America. They did not unite, as some have supposed, because they anticipated the blessings of civilization, but their hopes were anchored upon a promise which could only be fulfilled by their first becoming members of a family, and then of that larger family which is called a nation. Thus arose human society out of the common expectation of regeneration of men. It's the course which is long and painful and very complicated, and oftentimes none but but he who sees the end from the beginning could perceive that it would even advance. For if the second stage has shown what great benefits have been bestowed upon mankind by the restoration of Yahuwah's image through the works of his Christ, yet its early state was but a proof that mere human efforts would not suffice for that recovery. For how could human society obtain any perfection, seeing that men speedily forget the object of their existence? From which it followed that since one half of the human race was weaker than the other, and that in each sex there were differences both in mind and body, all respect was lost for those who, as possessors of an immortal spirit, had equal right to be the strongest, the wisest, or the wealthiest. However, their place among the community of mankind, they were treated with contempt and cruelty. Slaves were trodden under feet, and women were treated as second-class citizens, even though they had all come from the same blood. It was reserved for the church to loose the feathers of slavery and to preach the gospel to the poor and to give due honor to the weaker vessel in the household of Yahuwah. That such would be the state of the societies was obvious even when you look at the first departure from their family of common parents, which are the parents of all mankind. From them spring two races, the sons of God and the children of men, the respective forerunners of the world and of the church. The children of Seth built their social life upon the divine system in which they placed and lived in expectation of the promise of the world's recovery and the recovery of man. Cain and his family were driven out from Yahuwah's presence and sought by their own contrivance to supply what seemed irreparably lost. Society arose in both from that family relation in which Yahuwah had placed them, and mankind were bound together not by voluntary agreement, but by natural affinity, and the nation was but a wider household. But through society itself, thus a divine principle was yet to have come into fruition, which would minister unto the arts of life and the means of security. These had human origin and were produced by the self-interest and necessities of man. Seth dealt with his father Adam. And when Seth and his first child were born, we read no consequence, however, but the establishment of Yahuwah's public worship. And then men begin to call upon the name of Yahuwah. No doubt the voice of prayer had been before heard, but this multiplication of the family necessitated some more formal establishment of divine service. Cain, on the other hand, whose object was to defend himself from being a fugitive in the earth, built the first city and called it after the name of his firstborn son. And the two races continued to run parallel to one another. In the time of Lamech, the seventh from Adam, the powers of human society came to a head. His children were leaders in several ways to herdsmen and to artificers of the world. Adaber Jabal, he was the father of such as dwell in tents and have cattle, and his brother's name was Jubal. and he was the father of all as such as handle the harp and organ. And Zillah, she bare also Tubal-Cain, an instructor of every artificer in brass and iron. These gifts were in fact but manifestations of the sovereign wisdom, from which human skill as well as human conscience proceeds. The confused remains of the divine image which had formerly been perfected in its manifestation. This image was never so far effaced as not to show the traces of what it once had been. Thus, the perfection of human skill was shown in Bezalel to be Yahuwah's inspiration, and that is precepted with Ezekiel chapter 30 verse 1 Ezekiel chapter 31 verse 3, where it says that Bezalel was inspired by Yahuwah and artificery of creating instruments, tools, and things of that sort. And every man's society had its sanction and strength from the wisdom of Yahuwah. By it kings reign and princes decree justice, as mentioned in Proverbs chapter 8 verse 15. But that of the worldly seed should be allowed to work out and develop these gifts of Yahuwah, that it should bring society to its strengths, and should build cities and provide arts which defend and adorn them, is a proof that there is a certain maturity of man's social state, which is to be brought about through human agency. This Lamech beheld in the labors of his children, and to it probably he referred when he compared the security of himself, the seventh from Adam, with that of the first founder of the city. And he heard that Yahuwah had sentenced this first founder, Cain, but he derided it when he thought of his strength and ingenuity, of his family, and of the safety which society conferred. If Cain shall be avenged sevenfold, surely Lamech 70 and sevenfold. Far different was the confidence in the same generation which was displayed by the descendant of Seth. The dispositions of men already indicated that the advancement of civil society will be attended by a neglect of its real end. But in this very generation did Yahuwah raise up a testimony to the reality of his moral government, and to the vanity of all attempts at improvement in which he was forgotten. It is quoted and says, Enoch, the seventh from Adam, prophesied concerning these, saying, Behold, the Lord cometh with 10,000 of his saints to execute judgment upon all, and to convince all that are ungodly among them of all their ungodly deeds, which they have ungodly committed, and of all their harsh speeches which ungodly sinners have spoken against him. And that's mentioned in Jude 14:15. And Enoch walked with Yahuwah, and he was not, for Yahuwah took him. Genesis chapter 5 verse 24. Thus the early were the principles of human society, and the hollow rule of heavenly communion brought into opposition with one another. Both arose from those natural relations with which Yahuwah has formed mankind, and from those powers and endowments which he has given. But they speedily took their leave of one another. Yet the happiness of man's life depends upon them moving together with an equal pace, and the complete establishment of Christ's kingdom implies their perfection in combination. And the great object of history is to show how these powers diverge from one another, and how they have again been brought to unite. Their times of meetings are the grand epics and the annuals, of mankind. Before the flood, these powers of the world and the church were altogether divided. In one family, Yahuwah was worshipped, and Adam's life of 931 years enabled him to testify of Yahuwah's works to 8 generations of his children. Methuselah, his descendant in the 8th generation, lived 969 years so that he could talk with Noah, his grandson, and with his children, and tell them what the first man had declared to him. But out of this household, Yahuwah was also forgotten. All flesh has become corrupted in his ways upon the earth. Even the worldly purpose of human society were destroyed, and it did not yield present security for anyone. The earth was corrupted before Yahuwah, and the earth was filled with violence. And Yahuwah said unto Noah, the end of all flesh is come before me, for the earth is filled with violence through them. And behold, I will destroy them with the earth. But Noah found grace in Yahuwah's eyes. And with that, that is the end of chapter 1. So what I'll do now is I'll give you what I received from chapter 1, and we'll shore up this video. The 5 Empires. An outline of ancient history is a small in stature book from the late 1800s regarding the alleged historical accounts from the 5 empires who are attributed to the controlling of a large portion of the known world during their respected times. These empires are written as the Assyrians, the Persians, the Grecans, the Romans, and the Church of Constantine, which is lastly mentioned. And in this 23 chapter book, the historical accounts and the dealings of these empires from their own surviving records and artifacts and monuments, which are co-signed or rather also accounted within the historical accounts of other nations, which are redeemed or called lesser nations. Lesser nation. We know that there is a nation of Tahiti. It may not have been Babylon or Rome, but there is a nation. They're just a lesser nation. So within these lesser nations, through either war, treaties, commerce, or trade, they engaged in some form of communication, which can either validate or destroy supposed accurate events of these nations and 5 empires as it lines up to the development and history of man upon this planet. This literature also follows the history of Yahuwah's interaction with his chosen people throughout the times of these 5 empires. Now, chapter 1, the antediluvian age, covers pages 1 through 7, and it begins by stating the original object of man's being was declared of his manner in creation. And it says, as man was created in Yahuwah's image, he was created by natural perfection of his creation, which he attributes to the Creator. He had Yahuwah's image being within him until he fell in disobedience, which thus changed his outer and inner man, and he was cut off. Man's outer image lost its uniformity with the holiness of the outer countenance and image of Yahuwah, and the image within man was corrupted and debased. If you look over the text and you ask the Spirit of the living Father to help you get understanding on that, that was a very big thing. I don't know if a lot of folks give a lot of stock on just how the fall of man, because a lot of folks are worried about their nation specifically and the things and how history has played out for their nations, but the fall of man in general really started the whole ball. Let's continue. Chapter 1 then moves into advising that man was not always fully forsaken. However, in this new form of his creation, he had to learn in which way he would be renewed or restored. And in some measure, he would have never known had not the hope been deposited in him by being spoken to Yahuwah, who advised that he would redeem man from out of his family. Now, this supposed interaction occurs not in the Bible literature, but can be found within two books, the Book of the Bee and the Cave of Treasures, respectively, which I have read both accounts, and the recorded and submitted accounts are identical. They were originally found in Greek and in Syriac. So if you want to read about this promise that was given unto Adam and Eve, this is where you will find it. Next, man's existence now was to learn again in how this hope was to come into fruition. But the process started with the trust in the Father's word, and then to learn what the weaknesses and degradation of his new fallen state and countenance would be, and the nature in which would govern him during his journey. Secondly, what manner and which way ultimately regeneration and the purity that was lost would be restored. The author then submitted that the fallen man's hopes were anchored on the promise, as I told you where that promise was mentioned, Cave of Treasures, in the Book of the Bee, and then learning to become a nation by first starting families, and then those families coming together to build nations, which the author ascribes to the start of societies, and from within this the complicated, painful, and arduous journey in the process of restoration thus would begin. I thought that was fantastic articulation from the author, because there is a process. If you think the way that we have learned things, we have had teaching, we have had examples. But if you're talking about the first group, the first pair, because of the fall and how quick it happened, they were cut off. So they had no parents that they could lean on how to be people, how to build homes, how to. It really was painful. It really was complicated. And truth be told, when you started doubting for yourself, it's very similar, because though you have examples and though you have those you can call on, there is a process that you still have to walk through for yourself. Let's continue. The author then adds how such great benefits had been bestowed upon man's second stage, which was when the restoration of the image of man came in the obedience and work of the Christ, which was the recovery of the pureness and holiness in perfection without sin. Now, following this train of thought, he then adds, how could these building startup blocks of a budding society obtain any perfection when man ultimately, unfortunately, is prone to forgetting the object of his existence? I thought that point was spot on. There's even a scripture that says how man looks in the mirror and forgets what he looks like, which is an analogy to you forgot how you got here once it has been revealed unto you that it was Yahuwah, right? As one half of the creature man is weaker physically than the other, the natural receiving and understanding that differences of thought, perception of understanding, the process of understanding, as well as the rationalization are very different between the sexes, which in a fallen and darkened spiritual as well as moral state or moral state, respect was lost to those who they saw as weaker, and oppression became the trade of men in their fallen nature. Again, I thought the brother was on point in that articulation, because why would you oppress anybody if you are of the same stock? You are a person. It makes no sense. There was something within greed. There was something in the fallen nature that would allow or have a man think that it's beneficial to steward over someone else in such a cruel manner. So when the author wrote that in the first chapter, you can see it playing out in history, can you not? The growth of sin continued to grow with oppression and subjugation and marginalization of the weak in general, of both men and women, old and young, even though they all had an immortal spirit within them that equally qualified them to the rights and privileges of being acknowledged, of being respected, of being called the wisest, or having an opportunity to be the wealthiest, and a co-contributor to the infrastructure that they were building in these societies and families, and not just as the labor force. However, this was not the character of the antediluvian dispensation version of man, which saw the start of enslavement added to the list, along to cruelty and contempt of women, the trodden underfoot of those enslaved and poor, which sadly, traces of those things still play out in history, even though the antediluvians started from the same blood. The author then advises these injustices, such as slavery, were a typecast to the delivery of the gospel to the poor and to the sharing that in the house of Yahuwah even the weaker vessel has honor. Now at this point, as I'm reading this first chapter, I'm extremely surprised at what I've been reading so far, because as I said, this is an outline of the 5 empires, but this has a lot of in-depth spiritual I ain't gonna say spirit. This got a lot of the Father's spirit to me in making things plain on what was going down. And as I said, my man even gives you 404 BC as the time period when this was happening. So he's got a chronological order, even though that as you go into studying these things, they're very sparse and sometimes it's conjecture. But again, to have a reference is a fantastic thing. So it's about these nations and their imprint on what has become the structures that we know in the world. However, it is talking very in-depthly about Yahuwah, his promises, the restoration of man. I was like, whoa, wait a minute now, we might be on to something. So yeah, all right, so let's continue and let's end this up. Now, as stated, the author moves on to state society was obviously in a way that the separation or the departure of their common parents stemmed from one, the disobedience taken to another level by the sons of God, and he identified them as 2 races, the children of men and the sons of Yahuwah, which the author believes were the forerunners of the world and of the church. He then submits that the sons of Seth built their social life upon a divine system surrounding the expectation, or that was surrounded by the expectation of the promise of the restoration of men and the recovery of the world. I'd also like to submit at this time the sons of Yahuwah were in fact the sons of Seth. When I first began my scholarship and my research, I came across the conversation about the Nephilim. And when you look at the scriptures, it can receive, or it can read as though the sons of God or the sons of Yahuwah or of an extraterrestrial body, because it says that they slept with the daughters of men. However, I will submit to you that when you look at Hebrews chapter 1 verse 5, you'll receive that at no time has Yahuwah ever called an angel his son. And if he has never called an angel his son, then that negates that thought process which we receive through religion and theology, but is also written in the compilation on how translations were translated purposely or in error in what we call the Bible. And when you are able to study that, it will open up the door for you to receive where other instances that should not be pop up within the text. We're looking at you, Job, and the sons of God came to present themselves unto God, and the devil came. You sure about that? Because Yahuwah doesn't call his ministers of fire his sons. Now, the sons of Seth had been a lot more in line with holiness as they had been living as Adam had lived after the first separation. No new sin outside of Cain's lineage and his killing and shedding of blood and living in rebellion unto the ways of Yahuwah. The sons of Seth stayed in obedience until the 8th generation. Thus they fell again. But just submitting that from my own, take it as you will. Let's continue. Also, give me a second. Let me see where we are in here. Checking my notes. I also wanted to mention that just as it's a lot of ambiguity with the sons of Yahuwah and that understanding, I'd also like to take the time to mention the unwillingness and the consistent hiding of the names of the women that Cain had his children with and who Seth had their children with. The text is out there, and one would be far-fetched to think that knowing the names of those women and where they came from, especially when you read the documentation that speaks about the population of other people popping up, it wasn't shared that when Cain was born, he was born with a sister, and when Abel was born, he was born with a sister. And those sisters married the opposites, or were supposed to, until Cain killed Abel. And that sister had the children with Seth, and thus that line created, and Cain took the other sister. So it is hidden. And as you read your scriptures, one should always say, well, who are these women? Where did they come from? But that again is not something that is spoken about in our common rendition of what we've been given in our modern Christianity or theology. So I wanted to add that on, that is an issue and a red flag, and has always been a red flag. But with that, when I look at these texts and I go over the information of their scholarship, their historical prestige that they put on deck, when they start hiding or where they don't hit certain points, I take a mental note of that, because it has been proven to be too crucial in the supposed narrative of the story that, again, other people were popping up in relatively similar times of inception with Adam, Eve, Cain, Abel. And then you hear about cities being born and populated. So those two things I wanted to share as we continue to finish up. Now, children of Cain thought to replace what they deemed lost by their own means, is what the author then moves into, without seeking Yahuwah. And in each of these two mentioned forerunners, the expression of family, which is also the bedrock of the manifestation of societies, as mentioned on page 3, was coming into picture. We then have submitted that Seth had been dwelling with Adam, his dad, at the time of his first child's birth, and that no seeming consequence was mentioned save that the establishment of public worship now to Yahuwah was brought into deck. The author then precepts that by adding Genesis chapter 4 verse 26, which he then shows as a contrary to what Cain was doing, as he states he was more concerned with defending himself as a fugitive in the earth by building the first city of Enoch. And he precepted that with Exodus chapter 31 and verse 3. And thus he writes the two races of men, the men who are sons of Yahuwah, which the writer of Antiquity by the name of St. Augustine calls in his book the city of God, and those of the city of earth, which Augustine calls, he calls one faction the sons of Yahuwah, those of the city of God, and the sons of men he calls of the city of earth. His book is called The City of God. Both sets continued to grow and ran parallel to one another up until the time of Lamech, which the author proceeds to highlight with the sons born to Lamech, the next progression of civil advancement and creativity, as well as structural developments, as his sons were the head artificers, the head herdsmen, and the heads in creations with tools, which as a result also became leaders in their respective cities, which he precepts with Genesis chapter 4 verses 20 to 21. Now there's a very interesting add-on to the literature concerning the sons and the spirits which are documented as their influences. You can find those in some apocryphal and some pseudepigraphal writings, where they mention that when Jubal and Tubal created certain instruments, they were housed by demons. Now I will equally mention that I hold most of these accounts in a similar fashion, which is Gnostic or heretical. However, it is their connection to a factual foundation, which I also do see historically backed in a lot of books of antiquity, still going through dotting I's, crossing T's. But that's where you find those accounts. The author then adds that these abilities are traces left from the divine manifestations, which, when prior to the fall, all had possessed an equality if they would have been created in the harmony of obedience after Adam and Eve. He then submits how by the sovereignty of Yahuwah, both the children of Yahuwah and the children of men both have been given an allotted time again, to work out these lingering traces of divine ability. And the development of these traces or gifts or talents from Yahuwah would move forward each society. However, those men focus on building strength and the continued building of cities and their ways of defending the same through violence, which is then connected to Lamech comparing himself to Cain's building of the city of Enoch, and him and his sons' progression in building their cities respectively, and the advancement of the development of nations. Before mentioned by Seth's sons, which the author submits as a result, made Lamech declare in Genesis chapter 4 verse 24. Far different in their approach and in their actions were the progressions of these societies and families. As the children of Yahuwah followed the generation after generation of Seth, whom Yahuwah had raised for a testimony of his moral government, and he highlighted the spirit and the contrast of vain attempts of the flesh between the sons of Yahuwah in passing down that information and living in unity, and the sons of Cain growing in their wickedness, governed by the carnal nature of man, wishing to build for themselves and obtain for themselves what was removed by Yahuwah. A quotation from Jude was mentioned, as I said, Jude chapter 1 verse 14 to 15, as well as Genesis chapter 5 verse 24, concerning the saying of Enoch. Now I'm going to read Jude and then I'll read Genesis. That was Jude, and we're going to go with the verse, and we're going to start with verse 14, and then I'm going to read verse 15. And Enoch, also the seventh from Adam, prophesied of these, saying, Behold, the Lord cometh with 10,000 of his saints, to execute judgment upon all, and to convince all the ungodly among them of all their ungodly deeds, which they have ungodly committed, and of their harsh speeches, which the ungodly sinners have spoken. And now I'll read for you Genesis chapter 5 and verse 24. And Genesis 5 and verse 24 reads as such. And Enoch walked with Yahuwah, and he was not, and Yahuwah had taken him. Which the author seemed to illustrate how the principles of human society and of the hollow rule of heavenly communication brought opposition between the two classifications of men. One chose to adhere by telling of the restoration and of redemption of man and of the earth, and the others sought to make their own way. However, the completion of man's journeys depends on both, the author submitted. Excuse me, my page is acting a little silly on my notes. Moving independently until the fullness and the completion of which was to be seen when both are joined in perfection in the unity and obedience unto the Father by accepting his salvation under the shepherdship of his Christ, the high priest of man. These following chapters will show the greatest history of how these two aspects of man diverged from one another and how they were united in their times of meetings, shown through the history of man in the grand epochs. I thought that was awesome. That's why I wanted to say it again. in the annuals. So, as chapter 1 closes, we are directed to what we begin the accounts of the deluge or the flood, where the author highlights before the flood the children of men and the choice on how they lived and governed their lives were separate from the one family who had worshipped Yahuwah, which was in part to the length of the amount of days that Adam had in his testimony of Yahuwah, and the works of the sequential family members in the 8 generations, which would be respectfully and mindfully passed down to Methuselah, who, with his long age, passed it down to Noah, which since now the first separation had ended with the line of Seth taking wives of the children of men, all flesh had become corrupted. Genesis chapter 6 verse 4. Genesis chapter 6 verse 12. Thank you. The purpose of society was now destroyed, as it did not yield any security for any in its rightful place. The weak were oppressed, the poor were downtrodden, which harkens back to what was spoken on page 3 of the book. This marks the end of chapter 1 and starts to segue into the chapter after the flood, which is now in the time period of 2348 BC, and highlights the fact that the author chose to use the template of starting with the flood. Not bad. So, with this being said, this is the end of a review of chapter 1 of the 5 Empires by Mr. Wilberforce. Let me know what you think about what was stated in chapter 1. If there's anything that you have any questions on, let me know. And if there's anything I could do that would help when we move into chapter 2, let me know. With that being said, blessings and peace unto you and your household, in obedience and in strength and righteousness in the will and way of the Father. There is more oil.